therefore, the title of my talk is Globalization After COVID-19. What's happening to globalization as we sort of now slowly are emerging on the other end of this major crisis. So kind of want to start with this idea that globalization has crashed, which is very, very popular. So if you want to talk about what's happening after COVID-19 to globalization, well, it might very well be the end because globalization has experienced enormous restrictions and difficulties in the last couple of years as a result of the pandemic. So we all, of course, are still familiar with our lockdowns and social distancing and travel restrictions and home office work. So in a way, a lot of experts are thinking that globalization certainly has slowed down, and maybe we're even reverting back to an era that was before globalization, is a sort of an era of more regional and national dynamics. And that's a very popular view, but I think everybody can agree that certainly the pandemic has unsettled globalization. What I would like to point to, though, is that this unsettled era didn't really start with the pandemic. We've heard this idea that globalization is coming to an end already a couple of times before. So, if you look at this, the last 25 years, starting with the anti-trade protests in Seattle and around the world, where people were demonstrating against what they saw, sort of free trade destroying local workplace arrangements, sort of local manufacturing, especially in the United States. We're talking about areas like the Midwest and the West. That's sort of the first time when, after the 1990s, when globalization was really riding high, globalization experienced sort of a period of crisis, which then returned with 9/11 and post 9/11, right? Terrorism, global terrorism, which was seen again as a force that really is unsettling things. And that's why I called it the great unsettling, this last period of instability, volatility, insecurity, anxiety, polarization, due to sort of rapid social change and shocks to the system. The next shock occurred in 2008, 2009 with the global financial crisis that almost brought global capitalism to its knees, and was followed by what is now called the Great Recession and the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, where European countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland were sort of on the verge of truly going bankrupt and having to lay off a lot of government workers, not knowing how to pay their pensions. So again, it looked like sort of the global financing system that was responsible for this was coming to an end or breaking down. And then in the last decade, in the 2010s, we saw the first signs of nationalism returning, the nation state coming back, what's called the populist, the national or nationalist populist backlash. Obviously, Brexit, Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, all examples of nationalist, populist figures who were railing against globalism, railing against globalization, saying it was destroying jobs, saying that it was making the world unstable, and promising to make the nations great, and returning to a time when people were looking much more inward rather than outward. And then, of course, the pandemic, which is sort of the ultimate shock, as I just said, with regard to the kinds of lockdowns we went through, and trade, for example, really dwindling, coming almost to a screeching halt. To this very day, we're still dealing with global supply chain issues that are part of that. So it looked like globalization was in trouble. And now we're dealing with wars, major regional wars again, like in the Ukraine, which additionally sort of brings back this idea of let's retreat to the nation state. Let's not get too heavily into the international, because that's dangerous. So you can see this idea that we are experiencing deglobalization didn't really start with the COVID pandemic, even though I will give you that this was perhaps one of the major shocks that that globalization experienced. But this period of the great unsettling has been going on for a while. So in order to really figure out, are we looking at deglobalization, or are we perhaps looking at reglobalization, sort of a reconfiguration of globalization? I think we need to go back to basics. So let's talk just for a couple of minutes about what exactly do we mean when we talk about globalization, right? So my definition, short and sweet definition, is that globalization is about the worldwide expansion, or you could even say intensification, of social relations and consciousness. And I argue, even though this has been really, really accelerated and intensified over the last few decades, it's a long-term process that goes back at least to the Industrial Revolution. Some people say no, actually, it's a very, very long process. As a matter of fact, Homo sapiens, our species, is actually Homo globensis. And what that means is that obviously, everybody knows we're all Africans. Our mother continent is Africa. That's where anatomically modern human beings come from. About 70 to 100,000 years ago, nobody knows exactly. Our ancestors, our direct ancestors, walked out of East Africa. And as you can see here, spreading to Europe about 45,000 years ago. And then if you follow this along, Australia about 50,000 years ago, then up. Taiwan was a very important station because it was a crossroads getting humans up to Siberia and down to places like New Guinea and Philippines, and then crossing the Bering Strait 20,000 years ago, reaching the final tip, southern tip of South Africa, South America, about 15 to 12,000 years ago. That's when our ancestors truly had sort of colonized the entire world, with the exception, of course, of Antarctica, which obviously was not inhabitable at the time anyway. So you could say that globalization is really a long-term process, but like a car that shifts into higher gears, it goes through these thresholds where it gets accelerated, intensified, and obviously the last few decades, as I said, or you could even say since World War II, it's been extremely accelerated. So we have a definition, we have a sense of its history, that it's long-term, that it's been going on, that it's going through stages. What are the main qualities of globalization? And I would say that there are really three we have to mention here. One is interconnectivity. Globalization is about the forging of worldwide linkages and ties. Linkages, as we will get to, not just between humans, but also humans and things, humans and institutions, humans and ideas. We'll get to that in a second. So interconnectivity is certainly one important quality. Another important quality is mobility. Everybody would agree, right? We walked out of Africa. It's very slow rate of mobility, very low velocity, but nonetheless, mobility is about global flows. It's about people and things and institutions sort of moving. So this idea of interconnection and mobility are really important qualities. And then finally, some quality, the third quality that's very often forgotten, is that globalization is not just something that's going on in the world out there, but it's also going on in the world in here, in our heads. It's about imagination. It's about what I call the rise of the global imaginary, sort of understanding ourselves as part of an interconnected planet. And I think the first time this really hit billions of people was in the 1960s when, we saw the image of Earthrise taken by Apollo astronauts who were, flying around the moon and looking back to Earth rising. We realized that this is a very fragile planet and that we are really all in together on this planet. So that's what I really mean about imagination, subjectivity, consciousness, identity is as much part of globalization as interconnectivity and mobility. So these are sort of the main qualities. And finally, and it sort of concludes a little crash course on globalization, what we mean by it. Globalization is really what I see in terms of what are some of the major elements of globalization. I argue that we're talking about people, ideas, things, and organizations. So globalization is about moving bodies, moving people, interconnecting people, as tourists, as refugees, as business travelers, and so on. It's about the movement of organizations, like states that expand, empires that expand, military that's stationed around the world, like the US has over 600 bases around the world, which is a global sort of, if you want to call it institutional or organizational globalization formation. Clubs, football clubs, and I don't mean American football clubs, but footballs as in soccer clubs. You think of Manchester United having 300 fan clubs around the world. All of those sort of examples, global corporations, really reach around the globe. So that's a formation of globalization. And then we have moving and interconnecting things, ranging from small objects to large objects. Right in the 1990s, globalization was primarily seen as trade, the movement of things in new standardized containers, in new huge container ships, sort of going around the world, right? We talked about global supply chains. So that formation of globalization is about things interconnecting and things moving. And then finally, ideas, right? The interconnection of ideas, of data, of information. And particularly in the last few decades, that's been digitized. So this idea that we are now also thinking about globalization, not just in terms of people, organization, and things interconnecting and moving, but also ideas and data electronically connecting and linking. And all of those moving people's ideas, things, and organizations, that all of that cuts across economic, political, cultural dimensions and interacts with local places. So where you can really see moving ideas, moving people, organizations, and things is locally. Think of a place like Bangkok, and think of tourists there, or think of business travelers there, or think of sort of things reaching airports and getting moved around, right? So where you really see globalization in action is not on an abstract global plane, because we can't just step back unless we are astronauts, but we really see globalization at work locally, like a place like Hawaii. Right here on in these islands, we see the local and the global interconnecting, as I said at the beginning. Okay, so that sort of sets us up in very important ways, because what we now know is that globalization is not just one thing. It's not just trade, for example, or moving objects. It's also moving ideas. Globalization is not just about the expansion of the American military globally, for example, but it's also about people, immigrants or business travelers moving around. So think of globalization then, I'm saying, a little bit like a geological tectonic plates moving around, right? The world is made up of these huge plates that are slowly moving around, that are shifting, rubbing up against each other. And what makes for earthquakes is that some plates are moving faster, others are moving slower. In other words, some are hyperactive, let's call it that, and others not so much. And that means that even though all of these plates are sort of like connected, they're also colliding with each other. They also have their own little dynamisms that is sort of not necessarily synchronized or coordinated. And with that understanding of these four plates of globalization, we can then, I think, understand better and answer the question of whether we're looking at deglobalization or the reglobalization, which I raised at the beginning. So look at some of the data. This is a data point in 2016. And it basically shows you that, right, trade would be what I call objectified globalization, right? People would be sort of the embodied globalization. Capital, if you think of transnational corporation, would be more like institutional globalization, right? From 2005 to 2015, and by the way, these trends are pretty constant. Lately, during COVID, they fell off a little bit, but they came back. But what you can see is the globalization of information, what I call data or ideas, has been by far outpacing the other tectonic plates of globalization. So what we're seeing is a diverging movement. One part of globalization, let's call it digital globalization, maybe easier to remember than disembodied globalization. So digital globalization is moving much faster and more intense than the others. Now, that, if you think of tectonic plates, as I said before, is sort of giving us a sense that, hey, there may be a collision, there may be some sort of issues, there may be like an earthquake that's sort of happening, and Earth surface might get unsettled. Now you know why I call it the great unsettling. In other words, I'm already giving half away my story here, is I think that globalization is not really deglobalizing. We're not looking at an end of globalization, but we're looking at a sort of a reconfiguration, a reglobalization, with one formation being sort of hyperactive in comparison to others that are sort of stable or even slowly declining. Now, what does this mean with regard to globalization as a whole, right? We're looking at what I would call disjointed globalization, or, a fancy academic term would be disjunctive globalization. If you look at it in terms of speed, velocity, right? Here's digital globalization, disembodied globalization, data, information, ideas are moving much faster, more accelerated than the globalization of things, the globalization of institutions, the globalization of people or bodies. In other words, it's faster, it's outstripping, outpacing. And like a rubber band, things become stretched, right? Because all these formations really belong together. We sort of now analytically keep them apart, but they're sort of all connected, but one part is sort of moving way ahead of the others. If you look at it in a different way, in terms of intensity, you can see that digital globalization is encroaching on the other formations. In other words, sort of taking over, and I'll give you in a second a concrete example of what I mean. In a way, it's almost like cannibalizing other forms, it's cousins, because these are all cousins, right? Institutions, people, things are moving and interconnected, but it's sort of, digital globalization is sort of cannibalizing, taking bites out of the other formations. Now, this might look like a little bit an abstract process, so let's take a look at it more concretely. What do I have in mind here? Well, what has happened is, especially with COVID-19 being the great accelerator even of these trends of digital globalization becoming very intensified, is that lockdowns and social distancing have reduced, in a way, the connectivity of human bodies, of physical human bodies, but have enhanced our mobility and connectivity in cyberspace. This lecture is an example, right? I mean, before COVID-19, I probably would have been standing in a classroom right now and talking to you in person. Now we have an option. We didn't have an option a year ago because everything was online, but a lot of stuff that was embodied has just migrated to cyberspace. And Zoom has been booming, and Zuckerberg thought that it was really good to sort of reframe or rephrase or rename Facebook into Meta, because sort of like metaverse or cyberspace, right? Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, Snapchat, all of these platforms have taken off, right? Colleges, universities around the globe switch to online mode, and even though they want to switch back now, students in many cases are still saying, hey, wait a second, yeah, let's have some classes come back, but generally speaking, we're not really so much against it anymore because we're getting used to it. So in a way, the trends that were already there before the COVID crisis hit have been accelerated by the pandemic. Now, another concrete example, right, of what's happening here. Let's take a look at work trends. So one work trend we see is a movement towards digitization in terms of commerce. So 200 to 500% growth, meaning, right, 2 times to 5 times more e-commerce is underway as a surge in digital platforms is happening. I mean, we're all familiar with Amazon, but Amazon certainly is not the only one, right? I mean, we all have now many Alibaba with many examples of what's happening with regard to e-commerce. And that's getting only more intense, only faster. Remote work is another one. 30% of workers in advanced economies could work remotely 3+ days a week on a long-term basis by 2030. That's a huge chunk. We're talking about a third of people being sort of majority remote workers. A whole new term that's been coined is telemigration, meaning that more and more workers in distant parts of the world are performing work, even though they're physically not present. They're doing it, obviously, online. And that, in a way, has been initiated by countries in the global north, in the West, wealthy countries, post-industrial countries, that are engaging in labor cost-cutting measures. So I give you a concrete example. I have a friend who is a lawyer or a part of a law firm, a relatively big law firm in San Francisco. And about 5 years ago, they would hire on average between 10, 15, 20 part-time, full-time paralegals a year. And they would all come from the region. In other words, we're talking Bay Area mostly, those hires. And they would come into their offices and they would do the kind of work. Now he's telling me, with the pandemic and even post-pandemic, more than 80% of their paralegals are from Pakistan and other places in Southeast Asia. So in other words, what has happened is that they are hiring paralegals, paying them their local wages, which of course are way below the wages for paralegals in the Bay Area, saving themselves a whole bunch of money, and that work has gone online. What was embodied has become disembodied. And then, of course, automation. Everybody's talking about automation, right? And nobody knows exactly how much artificial intelligence and machine learning and Internet of Things and all of those things will sort of gobble up in terms of embodied work. But estimates are that it will be a significant chunk, and it's underway. So you can see what I mean by digital globalization sort of cannibalizing other forms, other formations of globalization, in this case, embodied globalization, and organizational or institutional globalization. So globalization has not disappeared. It's not an end of globalization. It has regrouped as a result of one formation sort of taking over and moving forward. Now, what does this mean with regard to consciousness? You remember I said at the beginning, globalization is not just happening in the world out there, but it's also happening in our minds. It creates what I call the unhappy consciousness. In other words, disjointed globalization dynamics produce an unhappy consciousness that is a divided or a double self. Now, what do I mean by that? We all increasingly are schizophrenic. We have two selves. The first self, let's call it the digital self. The digital self is the self that is right now at work as we are looking at the screen, embroiled in what? In cyberspace. And it's sort of, there's a certain form of enjoyment because the flexibility of global digital mobility is something that a lot of people enjoy, especially when it comes to gaming. I need not say more, right? There's a lot of flexibility there that we simply don't have in what's called meat space or physical space. So the digital self is spending more and more time in cyberspace, enjoys it, but while we are doing that, we're sort of frozen in meat space. I mean, we're sitting on our chairs, especially on our gaming chairs, but we are not really moving around very much. See, we're not really present in meat space. We're sort of, more or less just sitting here. Whereas in cyberspace, we're extremely active. So that's one form of self that we have. The other self is the physical self, the self that we are familiar with. And that physical self is also sort of enjoying the visceral attachments to the locality, right? Going to your favorite pub, going to hang out with your friends, to go and surf, actually enjoy the physical movement of the waves kicking you around and so on. And spending more time in cyberspace means that we are enjoying that kind of physical stuff, but we're missing cyberspace. We are absent from cyberspace during those times. So the first thing that we come when we come out of the ocean after half an hour of surfing is we check our iPhone, right? So there we are again, getting sucked back into cyberspace. So in a way, when we're in cyberspace, we're unhappy because we're not in meat space. When we're in meat space, we're not fully happy because we're not in cyberspace. We'd like to be at both places, but of course we can't. And that divide itself sort of is a contradiction that we can't solve. And it creates what? Desires to bring it together, to make it whole, the self. Frustrations that we can't. Anxiety when we can check our messages, when we're sort of physically present. And a form of unhappiness because we really, in a way, would like to enjoy both at the same time. So digitization and sort of what I call this digital globalization, which of course is what the internet is all about, even China that's trying to block out, or other countries that are blocking out sort of this global digitization have been unsuccessful, is creating, subjectively speaking, a divided self that is sort of unhappy because one dimension is always missing. So let me end my talk not on a downer, but on an upper, right? What is to be done? I argue what we really need with regard to globalization after COVID-19 is a globalization reset. Let's hit the reset button, please. And what does the reset button mean? It means rebalancing and realigning those formations that are out of whack. Disjointed globalization, meaning digital globalization, it's been left way too far ahead. It needs to be brought back into line. We need some good sense of East Asian balance, which we have lost, right? The good old sense of Chinese harmony. We need more harmony among those formations, meaning that I am not telling you you should smash your smartphones or stop your VR games. But what I'm saying is let's cut back on usage and let's reconnect physically, institutionally, and objectively again, more. In other words, let's spend more time in meat space. Let's try to balance it out. And what does it mean? Well, you may be shocked, but the average American is now spending out of the average 16 to 17 waking hours a day that are allotted to us, how many hours in cyberspace, right? 7 is the answer. So 7 out of 17 hours are spent in cyberspace, which might be just a little bit too much. So what I'm saying is we want to turn the unhappy consciousness into a happy consciousness or happier consciousness on a subjective level. On an objective level, if we want to sort of reestablish again our physical presence, our embeddedness in the local, which also links us, obviously, globally, then what we really need to do is we need to sort of slow down a little bit, spend a little bit less time with digital globalization. So I am arguing here for harmony. I'm not arguing for opting out, but let's not have digital technology sort of eat us up. That's basically the short and sweet message that I have at the end of this talk. So globalization after COVID-19 is not deglobalization. It's not an end of globalization, but it's reglobalization, reconfiguration of those 4 formations. Thank you very much. Mahalo, Nui Loa.